Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're taking a look at a really important Supreme Court decision, Rucho v. Common Cause. This case grappled with the very tricky issue of partisan gerrymandering, which is when states draw those congressional district lines in a way that gives one political party a big, unfair advantage.
Right, like rigging the game before it even starts.
Exactly. We're going to break down the court's decision and then dive into the arguments from both sides.
Let's get into it.
So to kick things off, what did the court actually decide in Rucho v. Common Cause?
Well, the court basically decided that partisan gerrymandering claims are, quote, non-justiciable. What that means is they basically said federal courts can't really resolve these kinds of disputes.
So they basically washed their hands of it, said, not our problem.
Pretty much. They said this is not something for them to decide.
Interesting. So if the court decided it wasn't their place to intervene, what were the arguments that each side brought to the table? Let's start with the folks who brought the case to the court in the first place. What was Rucho's side of the story?
Okay, so the folks bringing the case, the appellants, were represented by Paul Clement, and his argument really leaned heavily on the Constitution. He pointed out that the Constitution gives state legislatures the main responsibility for drawing those congressional district lines.
So states' rights, essentially.
Yeah, right, that was a major part of it. And Clement took it a step further, suggesting that the Constitution already has a built-in way to keep states in check if they go too far with partisan districting. He said the Founding Fathers gave Congress the power to oversee state election rules.
So Congress could step in if things get out of hand.
Exactly. The idea is that if a state legislature comes up with some ridiculously partisan maps, Congress has the power to pass a law and fix it.
Interesting. So their argument is that the solution isn't in the courts, it's in the halls of Congress.
Exactly. And Clement brought up another point that I think is really important. He said, how would courts even decide when partisan gerrymandering has gone too far? Like, what's the line?
Yeah, it seems like a subjective thing, right? What seems unfair to one person might seem perfectly reasonable to someone else.
That's exactly it. Clement said there's no clear standard that courts could use to make those judgment calls, and he pointed to past Supreme Court cases that tried to deal with gerrymandering. They kind of stumbled around, came up with some rules, but nothing really stuck.
No lasting solution.
Right. Clement even questioned whether voters have a specific legal right that's violated just because their district leans heavily towards one party.
Like, is there a right to live in a district that's politically balanced? That's a fascinating question.
It is. And Clement basically argued that, you might feel like your vote counts less if you're in a super partisan district, but legally speaking, that doesn't necessarily give you grounds to sue.
Okay, I see. So their argument is that the courts shouldn't even be involved in this.
Right. They also brought up a previous case, Davis v. Bandemer, where the court actually did consider a partisan gerrymandering claim. But in Rucho, Clement was basically saying, look, if the court is serious about staying out of this business, they might need to walk back some of the things they said in that older case.
So they're suggesting the court re-examine its past approach to this.
Yeah, that was the suggestion. Then Clement made another interesting argument. He said drawing districts with partisanship in mind isn't automatically a bad thing. He even argued that it could actually lead to more accountability.
How so?
Well, if a political party openly draws districts to help its own candidates, then voters can see exactly what they're doing and hold them accountable in the next election.
So transparency, even if it's partisan, can be a form of accountability.
That was his argument. He also brought up the Elections Clause of the Constitution, which gives states the power to make rules for federal elections. Clement argued that if a state constitution tries to limit how its legislature draws districts, like, say, through an independent commission, that could actually clash with the Elections Clause and create its own set of constitutional problems.
So even efforts to curb gerrymandering could be seen as problematic under this view.
Exactly. And Clement was really adamant that proportional representation where a party wins about the same percentage of seats as they got in the overall vote shouldn't be the standard for judging gerrymandering. He argued the Constitution doesn't require it, and anyway, with districts, you're never going to get perfect proportionality.
Right, you're drawing lines on a map, not just dividing up numbers.
Precisely. Finally, Clement pointed to other ways to address partisan gerrymandering, like those independent commissions some states have, citizen-led initiatives, and even potential action by Congress to pass federal law.
So in a nutshell, their side is saying this is a political issue, not a legal one, and there are other ways to address it besides the courts.
That's a good summary. Now let's look at the other side, Common Cause and the League of Women Voters.
Okay, so let's hear what they had to say. What were their arguments for why the courts should get involved?
Well, Common Cause was represented by Emmett Bondurant, and he painted a pretty stark picture of the situation, especially in North Carolina. He described the congressional map there as, and I quote, an extreme partisan gerrymander designed to rig congressional elections.
Rigged. That's a strong word. What evidence did they present to back that up?
Bondurant's argument was that the main goal, the driving force behind how those districts were drawn, was to give one party as much advantage as possible. And he said this went so far that it completely overshadowed any other reasons you might have for drawing districts a certain way.
Like keeping communities together or following natural geographic boundaries.
Right, exactly. So for them, it was all about the intent behind the map. They weren't saying that any time a district map gives one party an edge, it's illegal. They were focused on situations where the intent was clearly and overwhelmingly partisan.
And how do they argue that this kind of intent violates the Constitution?
Bondurant argued that when a state legislature intentionally discriminates against voters from a certain party when they draw districts to dilute those voters' power, that violates their constitutional rights. It's about treating people differently based solely on who they vote for.
So your political affiliation shouldn't determine whether your vote really counts.
Right. And Bondurant even suggested that if you see a big difference between the statewide vote and how many seats each party wins, that could be a sign that something fishy is going on.
Well, if one party wins a majority of the votes, but ends up with a tiny number of seats in Congress.
Exactly. That raises red flags. And they argued that the court has a duty to step in and prevent this kind of manipulation. Bondurant said legislatures shouldn't be able to predetermine the winners and losers before anyone even casts a ballot.
So it's about safeguarding democracy itself.
That was a major part of their argument.
And what about the League of Women Voters? What was their perspective?
The League of Women Voters was represented by Allison Riggs. She presented a very structured approach, proposing a three-part test that courts could use to evaluate partisan gerrymandering claims.
Interesting. Break down that test for us. What were the three parts?
Okay, so the first part was about proving partisan intent, showing that districts were deliberately drawn to disadvantage one party. The second part was about looking at the actual effects of the map, both in individual districts and statewide, to see if it really did hurt one party over the long term. And the third part was about considering whether there were any legitimate, nonpartisan reasons for those effects.
So it's a pretty comprehensive test, looking at both the why and the what of the map.
Right. It's not just about showing that one party benefited. You have to show that it was intentional and that it had a real impact. And Riggs made a point of saying that their test wasn't just about achieving proportional representation.
So they weren't saying that every party needs to win a number of seats exactly proportional to their share of the vote.
Exactly. They said their test would allow for some variation, but it would target situations where the map is clearly designed to discriminate against one party and its voters.
Okay, I understand. What else did Riggs argue?
Well, she also brought up the role of technology. She argued that with all the data and mapping tools available today, it's easier than ever to create these really sophisticated gerrymandered maps that lock in partisan advantage for a long time.
So it's not just about old-fashioned backroom deals anymore.
Right. It's gotten much more sophisticated. And Riggs argued that these high-tech maps are much harder to fix through the normal political process.
Like they don't naturally correct themselves over time as populations shift or political winds change.
Exactly. And finally, Riggs made a pretty bold argument about the court's own reputation. She said that if the court didn't do anything about extreme partisan gerrymandering, it would actually damage their own credibility.
Oh, so they're basically saying, if you don't act, you're basically condoning this.
That was the argument. They said that inaction would send the message that the court doesn't care about fair elections.
I see. So lots of arguments from both sides. When the case actually went before the court, what were some of the key points the justices brought up? What were they really focused on?
One of the main things the justices wrestled with was this whole idea of a justiciable standard. They kept pushing both sides to come up with a clear, workable rule that courts could use to decide when partisan gerrymandering goes too far. And they didn't want a rule that basically just mandated proportional representation, which, as we've discussed, most of them seem to agree isn't required by the Constitution.
So they're looking for a rule that's clear, practical, and doesn't go too far.
Exactly. And they also spent a lot of time debating the role of the courts versus the role of state legislatures. Some justices were worried about courts getting too involved in politics, while others seemed more concerned about the potential for partisan gerrymandering to really undermine democracy.
It's that classic tension between judicial restraint and protecting fundamental rights.
Right. And another point that kept coming back to was the idea of a concrete harm to voters. Like, what specific injury are voters suffering because of partisan gerrymandering that a court can actually fix?
It sounds like they were really grappling with some fundamental questions about the nature of representation and voting rights.
They were. And then, as you might expect, proportional representation kept popping up in the discussion.
Even though the folks challenging the maps insisted they weren't demanding strict proportionality.
Right.
Some justices seem to think that any argument about the harmful effects of partisan gerrymandering was implicitly based on the idea that proportional representation is the ideal. The challengers tried to push back on that, saying they were just trying to identify situations where the map was so skewed that it couldn't possibly be the result of a neutral process. They even suggested using computer models to create lots of different maps based on nonpartisan criteria to see how the actual map compared. So they're using technology to try and demonstrate that the map in question is an outlier, a result of deliberate manipulation.
That was the idea. And the justices also spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to measure the effects of a gerrymandered map, like how big does the partisan advantage have to be and how long does it have to last before the courts should step in.
It sounds like they were searching for a bright line rule, but it's a really messy issue.
It is. And they also talked about alternative solutions to gerrymandering, like those independent commissions we discussed, and the possibility of Congress passing a law to address it. And of course, they looked at the historical context. What did the framers of the Constitution think about gerrymandering? Did they envision a role for the courts in policing this?
Lots of different angles to consider. And in the end, the court decided that these claims were non-justiciable.
They did.
Now, let's put on our imaginary robes and step into the 10th chair perspective. What might a hypothetical 10th justice have thought about this case?
Well, from that 10th chair, you could argue that while states have a lot of power over how they draw their congressional maps, that power isn't unlimited. It shouldn't be used to intentionally silence the voices of voters simply because of their political beliefs. And in this case, there was a lot of evidence suggesting that the map was deliberately drawn to create an extreme partisan advantage. Now, it's true that it's hard to come up with a perfect legal test for gerrymandering, but the difficulty of defining the problem shouldn't stop the courts from protecting people's fundamental rights, especially when other solutions like action by Congress might not be enough. Just because it's hard to draw a bright line doesn't mean the courts should ignore blatant abuses of power that threaten the very core of our democracy. And you could argue that to say the framers never intended for courts to have a role in this, well, that ignores the broader principles of fairness and equal representation that are woven throughout our Constitution.
That's a powerful perspective from the 10th chair. Today's deep dive into Rucho v. Common Cause reveals the incredibly complex and often contentious issue of partisan gerrymandering. The case forces us to confront the tension between state power over elections and the fundamental principle of fair representation for all citizens. The debate over the role of the judiciary in this area is far from over, and this decision has significant implications for how our elections are conducted and how our democracy functions. What aspects of this case and this discussion resonated most with you? What questions linger in your mind about the balance between state authority and individual rights, the role of the courts in policing political boundaries, and the very essence of a fair and represented democracy? The conversation continues, and we encourage you to engage with these complex and vitally important questions.